And following the Amsterdam attacks last week and the continued threats of violence against Jews, is it safe for Israelis to travel to Europe? Joining me now to discuss the alarming rise in anti-Semitism across Western Europe is Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism, Michal Cotler-Wunsh. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
So let's jump right in. Is it safe for Israelis to travel to Europe, or should they start looking for new travel destinations?
Look, it's not just about Europe. We have to be very, very clear. The pogrom that took place in Amsterdam should not be looked at just through the lens of Amsterdam nor Europe. It is part and parcel of an entire year of what is a tsunami of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of October 7th, the worst attack of Jews since the Holocaust, and the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, including in its new strain, anti-Zionism that denies Israel's very right to exist. And it's not just about not traveling to Europe, because we have to be very, very clear. What is happening on the streets is happening in university campuses and is happening in sports events and in cultural events and in many, many manifestations. So actually, and I am a part of a coalition of special envoys from around the globe. And what is most critical, and I have said so to the rest of my colleagues as well, is that we expect not just words, but actions of governments that include the implementation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the result of a long democratic process that's been adopted by more than 40 countries, but that has to be implemented if we are going to be able to identify and combat what is running rampant in the streets that, as I said, in a premeditated and planned attack, targeted and attacked Israelis in the streets of Amsterdam, but without understanding that it is part and parcel of the anti-Zionism, this new strain of anti-Semitism that demonizes and delegitimizes and applies double standards to the state of Israel, we will not be able to put the genie back in the bottle that has been clearly unleashed around the world. I remind us, in the United States, in Washington, the only kosher restaurant on the night of Kristallnacht, its windows were shattered. In New York City, visible-looking Jews, 6-year-old child was grabbed from his hand by a passerby. In Chicago, again, protests, outside of synagogues. In Montreal, in Toronto. And that is the moment that we're in. It's not just about traveling or not going to sports events. It is much larger, it is much bigger, and the genie being let out of the bottle, anti-Semitism unleashed in this way, is not just about Jews. It predicts a very, very real threat to the societies, to the places, and to the spaces in which it is thriving, it is infecting, it is spreading.
And so, as you've detailed, we really do see an alarming rise in anti-Semitism throughout Western Europe, throughout the world. And we do know that this is in part or even mainly due to a large influx of Muslim immigrants, the vast majority of which have been indoctrinated with sort of an innate hatred of Israel, of the Jews, and, as you mentioned, even of Western civilization or Western culture. And it seems that European governments are doing very little to combat this, opting instead to appease them, turning a blind eye to their violence on the streets, as we've seen and as you've detailed this past year. I mean, what do you make of this, and what can European governments do to regain the trust of their Jewish communities, of Israelis, and of the world in combating anti-Semitism?
So let's be very, very clear. Radical Islamism actually threatens the foundations of the societies in which it not only targets Jews. As I said before, anti-Semitism is a predictor. It's the most reliable predictor. And I did mention the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. It is a definition of anti-Semitism that anybody rolling out a national strategy or condemning these acts and then saying they are committed to combating anti-Semitism has to be able to identify it. And to identify it, you need to define it. That IRA working definition is a resource, but at this moment in time, without using it in every national strategy, university plan, law enforcement mechanism that actually intends to be able to identify the anti-Semitism that must be combated, that failure to use that definition will fail to be able to, as I said, put the genie back in the bottle. And yes, it is radical Islamists and jihadists and not pro-Palestinian protests. Let's be very, very honest and very, very clear. the protests or the encampments that hold up signs that say from the river to the sea are not pro-Palestinian. They're pro-terror. They are pro-Hamas. They are pro the murderous Islamic regime of which Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis are proxies. And the understanding that if we want to test it, we can just look at the lack of responses or the silence, if you will, to the hours and hours of footage of the torture of innocent civilians in Gaza by Hamas to understand that it is the West that's emboldening genocidal terror proxies and the Islamic regime of Iran, emboldening them. For them, human tragedy is the strategy. And the silence that we have witnessed, including, yes, you're right, in European countries, and the lack of implementation of that IRA working definition in all of those strategies is part and parcel for the mainstreaming of this anti-Semitism that makes it so dangerous, so lethal, as we said, in the streets of Europe, but also in the streets of North America and South America and Australia, not just for Jews and not just for Israelis, but for the spaces and places that allow this anti-Semitism to infect, to spread, and to become mainstream.
Absolutely. And first, we have to define it to be able to combat it. Michal Cotler-Wunsh, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about this very important issue today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.